You know, we were going to write together 2 weeks before he died.
No.
We talked about it.
Wow.
We were going to get together and write, and we never got to.
At 90, the filters don't just thin out, they evaporate. Loretta Lynn spent a lifetime playing the polite Kentucky girl when the cameras were rolling, but behind those rhinestones was a ledger of every slight, every power move, and every backstab she endured in Music City.
Well, I never did think I was pretty.
Are you pretty now?
I do the best I can do.
Loretta, you're a pretty girl.
Well, thank you.
You're better
I
than a pretty
appreciate
girl.
that.
You're a beautiful girl.
I appreciate you telling me that.
You don't survive 60 years in the Nashville trenches without catching some shrapnel. Today, we're opening the vault on the 7 names she kept in the dark section of that ledger. Jean Shepard, the cold shoulder at the Opry. Loretta Lynn didn't just walk into the Grand Ole Opry in 1960. She crashed into it like a localized weather event. She was a mother of 4, with a voice like a high-tensile wire, and a husband who wasn't afraid to use his elbows to get her a slot. But while the audience saw a Cinderella story in gingham, the established women of country music saw a threat to the hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy sat Jean Shepard. Jean was the grande dame, a hard-nosed traditionalist who had fought tooth and nail to be the solo female star of the 50s. When Loretta arrived with her wild Kentucky energy and her songs about cheating and birth control, Jean didn't just disapprove, she reportedly tried to build a wall. The friction wasn't just about music, it was about class and decorum. Jean believed in a certain Nashville polish, a way of carrying oneself that involved being a lady first and a singer second. Loretta, by contrast, was raw. She talked about the pill, she talked about Fist City, and she talked about the dirty side of marriage. According to industry lore that Loretta finally let slip in her later years, Jean tried to organize a blackball movement among the Opry ladies. The goal was simple: treat the newcomer with such icy silence that she'd pack up her guitar and head back to the hollow. Loretta recalled the feeling of walking into a dressing room and watching the oxygen leave the room as soon as she entered. It was a calculated, professional hatred designed to protect a territory. But Loretta had survived Butcher Hollow. She wasn't going to be scared off by a few high society sniffs in a backstage hallway. This was her first real taste of the mean girls of Music Row. She realized that the sisterhood of country music was often a facade maintained for the fans, while behind the curtain, it was a blood sport. Jean Shepard represented the gatekeepers who thought they could dictate who stayed and who went. Loretta's hate for this treatment wasn't about Jean as a person, but about the seniority trap, the idea that you had to pay your dues by being bullied. Loretta eventually found an ally in Patsy Cline, who famously told her to ignore the old hens. That intervention changed everything. It turned Loretta's resentment into a fuel source. Every time Jean or her circle gave Loretta the cold shoulder, Loretta went out and sang louder. She stopped trying to fit into their mold and leaned harder into her own uncouth style. By the time the 70s rolled around, Loretta wasn't just a peer. She had eclipsed them all. In her final interviews, when she looked back at those early Opry days, she didn't mince words about the women who tried to freeze her out. She saw them as the first hurdles she had to jump, and she jumped them with a grin on her face and a chart-topping hit in her pocket. She carried that grudge like a badge of honor, proof that she was too real for the velvet-wrapped elite. Jean may have had the seniority, but Loretta had the truth, and the truth didn't need a welcome committee. Could a man with a badge and a guitar be any more welcoming than the ladies? Faron Young, the sheriff's last stand. Faron Young was known as the singing sheriff, a man who carried himself with the swagger of someone who owned every sidewalk in Nashville. He was a hitmaker, a charmer, and a notorious loudmouth who didn't believe in filters or personal space. For a young Loretta Lynn, Faron represented the peak of the good old boys club, a masculine, alcohol-fueled culture that looked at female artists as either novelty acts or decorative set dressing. While the public saw their later duets and public appearances as signs of a playful friendship, the private reality was far more jagged. Loretta often recalled her early interactions with Faron as a series of tests she had to pass. Tests rooted in his apparent disdain for her backward ways. Faron had a habit of mocking her Kentucky accent, making jokes at her expense in front of industry power players, and suggesting that her songwriting was too simplistic to be taken seriously by the intellectual elite of Music Row. Loretta's issue for Faron's attitude was a slow-burn resentment that fueled her creative engine. She didn't just want to be better than the women, she wanted to be more formidable than the men who thought they were the law. Faron was the type of performer who believed the stage belonged to the person with the loudest voice and the brightest suit. Loretta, however, knew that the stage belonged to the person with the most honesty. The friction came to a head during the mid-60s when Faron allegedly made a disparaging comment about Loretta's lack of formal education, implying she was just a lucky hillbilly. Loretta didn't cry, she got even. She started writing lyrics that were sharper and more structurally sound than anything Faron was putting out at the time. She took his condescension and turned it into a weapon, proving that a hillbilly with a pen was more dangerous than a sheriff with a gimmick. Their relationship was a perpetual power struggle disguised as professional courtesy. Faron would push, and Loretta would shove back twice as hard. She hated the way he treated the little people in the industry, and she especially loathed his assumption that he could mentor her into something more commercial. To Loretta, Faron Young was the living embodiment of the ego that was rotting the heart of country music. He was flashy, he was arrogant, and he was convinced that his charm could paper over any insult. Loretta never forgot an insult. She kept a mental list of every time he tried to diminish her stature, and she used that list to ensure she never ended up like him, a legend consumed by his own myth. By the time they were elder statesmen of the genre, the dynamic had shifted, but the scar tissue remained. Loretta saw Faron as a cautionary tale of what happens when you value the spotlight more than the song. She watched his struggles and his outbursts with a mixture of pity and vindication. In the end, her hatred was actually a form of deep-seated professional rejection. She rejected his methods, his arrogance, and his version of stardom. She proved that you didn't need to be a loudmouthed sheriff to run the town. You just had to be the girl who wouldn't blink when the sheriff tried to run you off. If an ego could be handled with a sharp tongue, what happened when the ego tried to own your very soul? Porter Wagoner, the suit that smothered. If Nashville had a face in the late 60s, it was wrapped in 1,000 hand-sewn rhinestones and topped with a blonde pompadour that defied the laws of gravity. Porter Wagoner was more than a singer. He was a conglomerate. With his syndicated television show and his ironclad grip on his girl singer protégés, he was the architect of a specific brand of country stardom. To the outside world, Porter was the benevolent kingmaker, the man who gave Dolly Parton her big break. But to Loretta Lynn, watching from the wings, Porter Wagoner was something much more sinister. She saw him as the ultimate Svengali, a man who didn't just want to manage talent, he wanted to colonize it. Loretta's disdain for Porter wasn't rooted in a personal spat over a song title. It was a visceral, ideological hatred of the way he treated the women under his thumb. She watched the dynamic between Porter and Dolly with a protective, older sisterly rage, sensing that the glitter on those nudie suits was often used to blind the artists to the chains they were wearing. Loretta's friction with Porter was legendary because it was so quiet and yet so profound. She was one of the few artists with enough leverage to tell Porter no when he came knocking with advice or opportunities. She hated his paternalistic attitude, the way he spoke down to the women in the industry as if they were children who couldn't navigate a contract without a man's signature. On several occasions, Loretta reportedly witnessed Porter's temper and his controlling nature backstage at the Opry, and it turned her stomach. She viewed his version of the music business as a velvet-lined prison. While other singers were desperate to get a slot on the Porter Wagoner show, Loretta treated it like a chore. She didn't want the Porter rub because she knew it came with a price tag that involved her autonomy. Her hatred for him was her way of drawing a line in the sand for every woman in Nashville. She was the counter-narrative to his control. She was the woman who belonged to no one but herself and the coal miner who raised her. The resentment grew as Porter's public image as a gentleman continued to flourish while his private reputation for litigation and control worsened. Loretta was vocal in her inner circles about how much she loathed the Porter-style deal, a contract that essentially signed over an artist's soul for a bit of airtime. She saw him as the primary obstacle to the liberation of the female voice in country music. In her mind, Porter didn't want stars. He wanted puppets that looked good in the spotlight he provided. This fueled her to become even more fiercely independent with her own business affairs. She refused to let any man, no matter how influential his television show was, dictate her creative direction or her financial future. She used her negative feeling for Porter's methods as a blueprint for what not to do. She became the anti-Porter, a leader who empowered the next generation instead of trying to own them. By the time Dolly finally broke away from Porter in a flurry of lawsuits and heartbreak, Loretta felt a grim sense of vindication. She had been right all along about the suit that smothered. In her later years, Loretta didn't hold back when discussing the era of the big man in Nashville. She saw Porter as the relic of a time when women were expected to be grateful for the crumbs of stardom thrown from a rhinestone-clad table. Her critique was a masterclass in professional boundaries. She proved that you could reach the top of the mountain without ever having to kiss the ring of the man standing at the gate. Sometimes, however, the hate wasn't personal or professional. It was purely a matter of cold, hard, stolen cash. The Wilburn brothers, the legal trap. In the early days, they were the saviors. Teddy and Doyle Wilburn were the polished, harmonious duo who saw a rough-cut diamond in a young mother from Washington State and decided to polish her for the world. They gave her a spot on their television show. They helped her secure a recording contract with Decca, and they gave her the platform that would eventually make her the queen of country music. But in the shadows of that gratitude, a much darker emotion was brewing. As the years turned into decades, Loretta Lynn's relationship with the Wilburn brothers soured into a deep, agonizing hostility rooted in the most primal of industry betrayals: the theft of a creator's work. To the Wilburns, Loretta was a gold mine. To Loretta, the Wilburns eventually became the walls of the mine itself, closing in on her and stripping her of the very songs that had saved her life. The core of the resentment was a publishing deal that would haunt Loretta for the rest of her professional career. When she was young and desperate to provide for her children, she signed papers that gave the Wilburns company, Surefire Music, the rights to her compositions. As her hits began to stack up, "Don't Come Home A-Drinkin'," "You Ain't Woman Enough," "Fist City," the royalty checks were flowing, but they weren't all ending up in Loretta's pocket. She began to realize that the men who had discovered her were now effectively owning her. The strong emotion she felt for them was a unique brand of poison because it was mixed with the memory of their early kindness. It was the pain of being exploited by people you once considered family. Loretta spent years in and out of courtrooms, fighting a grueling legal war to regain control of her music. She loathed the way they used the fine print of a contract to tether her talent to their bank accounts, and she grew to despise the very sight of them in the halls of the Opry. This conflict transformed Loretta from a singer into a warrior. She hated the Wilburns not just for the money, but for the principle of the legal trap. She saw how the industry took advantage of uneducated rural talent, using complicated jargon to strip artists of their legacies before they even knew what a legacy was. Her feedback to the next generation was born from the fire of this feud. Read every line and then read it again. She became the cautionary tale and the advocate all at once. The Wilburn brothers represented the sharks that swam in the shallow waters of Nashville, and Loretta's refusal to go quietly into the night was a signal to every other artist on Music Row. She eventually stopped performing with them, stopped speaking to them, and dedicated a significant portion of her energy to exposing the predatory nature of publishing deals. By the time the legal dust settled, the damage to the relationship was irreparable. Loretta had won her freedom, but she never lost the bitterness toward the brothers who tried to keep her in a gilded cage. In her final decades, she spoke of the Wilburns with a sharp, cold clarity. She acknowledged their role in her start, but she never forgave the greed that followed. They were the architects of her most stressful years, the men who made her feel like a servant in her own house. Her hatred for the Wilburns was her most productive grudge. It made her a businesswoman, a fighter, and a protector of her own craft. She proved that no matter how much a brother helps you up, if he tries to keep his hand in your pocket, he's no friend of yours. But what happens when the enemy isn't a businessman in a suit, but a mirror image of yourself staring back from the charts? Connie Smith, The Battle for the Crown. If Jean Shepard was the gatekeeper of the past, Connie Smith was the looming shadow of the future. By the mid-60s, Loretta had finally carved out her space. But then came Once a Day. Connie Smith arrived with a voice that was technically flawless, a crystalline soprano that made every other singer in Nashville sound like they were singing through a screen door. To the critics and the label heads, Connie was the perfect female artist, pious, polished, and possessing a vocal range that seemed to touch the rafters of the Ryman without breaking a sweat. To Loretta Lynn, Connie Smith was the ultimate rival. Loretta's hate for the Connie Smith phenomenon wasn't about a personal grudge. It was a deep-seated professional loathing of the perfection Connie represented. Loretta was the voice of the dirt, the kitchen, and the bedroom. Connie was the voice of the cathedral. And in the zero-sum game of 60s country radio, there wasn't always room for both. The friction was fueled by the industry's obsession with pitting them against each other. Every time the Female Vocalist of the Year awards rolled around, it was a knife fight between Loretta's grit and Connie's grace. Loretta secretly resented the way the Nashville establishment held Connie up as the gold standard of how a woman should sound and behave. While Loretta was writing songs about slapping the other woman senseless in Fist City, Connie was projecting an image of serene, untouchable dignity. Loretta felt that this perfection was a lie that made real women feel inadequate. She hated the pressure to compete with a woman who seemed to have no flaws, and she grew tired of being told she needed to clean up her sound to match the Smith standard. This rivalry pushed Loretta into a defensive crouch that birthed some of her most aggressive and iconic work. She decided that if she couldn't be the prettiest voice in town, she would be the realest, the loudest, and the one you'd least want to cross in a dark alley. Behind the scenes, the tension was palpable. There were reports of the two stars avoiding each other's eye contact in the Opry wings. A Cold War played out in sequins and hairspray. Loretta's hatred was actually a form of artistic survival. She saw Connie as the living embodiment of the polished Nashville sound that threatened to erase the jagged edges of Appalachian music. To Loretta, every time Connie hit a perfect note, it felt like an indictment of Loretta's own raw, untrained delivery. She used that feeling of inferiority to sharpen her pen. She realized that she could never outsing Connie Smith in a technical battle, so she decided to outright her in a human one. She leaned into her flaws, her accent, and her unrefined storytelling as a direct rebuttal to the Connie Smith archetype. In her later years, Loretta would eventually soften, acknowledging that Connie was a great singer. But the competitive fire never truly went out. She viewed that era as a battle for the soul of country music, a choice between the celestial and the terrestrial. Loretta's animosity for the competition was what kept her from becoming complacent. She needed a Connie Smith to stay hungry, to stay angry, and to stay at the top of the charts. She proved that you don't have to be the most perfect singer in the room to be the most important one. Connie might have had the range, but Loretta had the scars, and in the end, it was the scars that the people wanted to hear about. Was it a feud, or was it just the price of being a queen in a town that only wanted one? But if the competition with the ladies was a matter of professional pride, her issues with the outlaws were a matter of life and death. Waylon Jennings, the outlaw she couldn't stand. While the rest of the world was falling in love with the leather vests, long hair,
and no-rules rebellion of the outlaw country movement, Loretta Lynn was watching from her ranch with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. At the center of that movement stood Waylon Jennings, the man who made bad behavior the hottest commodity in Nashville. To the average fan, Waylon was a hero fighting the system. To Loretta, he was a walking trigger for every trauma she had ever endured.
Loretta didn't detest Waylon because of his music. She hated the culture of chaos, harmful substances, and domestic instability that he normalized. Having spent decades trying to keep her own husband, Doolittle, from drowning in a bottle, she had zero patience for a group of grown men who celebrated getting high and staying rowdy as a professional philosophy. The friction between Loretta and the Waylon-led outlaws was rooted in the reality of the rural home. Loretta's songs were the diaries of the women left behind when men went out to play outlaw. She saw Waylon as the Pied Piper of the very lifestyle that broke apart the families she sang for. Every time Waylon bragged about his wild nights or his brushes with the law, Loretta saw the face of a wife waiting by the window with a cold dinner and a heavy heart. She loathes the romanticism of the struggle. To her, there was nothing romantic about a man who couldn't show up for a session because he was too far gone on pills. She was vocal about her disdain for the way the industry began to value edge over reliability. She famously stated that she didn't care how many records a man sold. If he couldn't keep his life together, he wasn't a man she wanted to share a stage with. Loretta's animosity for the Waylon era was also a critique of the double standard that governed Nashville. She realized that if a woman had behaved with even a fraction of the recklessness that Waylon and his crew displayed, she would have been chased out of town on a rail. Waylon was allowed to be dangerous, while Loretta had been censored just for mentioning a birth control pill. This hypocrisy burned her. She saw the outlaw movement as a massive step backward for the proper image of country music she had worked so hard to build. She didn't want the genre to be associated with the dirt and drama of the harmful substance culture. She wanted it to be about the dignity of the working class. She viewed Waylon as a man who was selling a dangerous fantasy to young boys who didn't know any better. Their interactions were often polite, but frostbitten. Waylon, for his part, seemed to respect Loretta's grit, but he represented everything she feared for the future of her children and her industry. She didn't buy into the rebel act for a second. To her, a real rebel was a woman who raised 6 kids on a shoestring budget while her husband was off raising hell. Her feedback to the industry during this time was a plea for self-preservation. She wanted the music to survive, and she knew that you couldn't build a legacy on a foundation of powder and whiskey. She outlasted the outlaws by staying sober, staying focused, and staying grounded in the reality of the hollow. Is it possible that her final target wasn't a person at all, but the very machines that replaced the souls of the singers she used to fight? But as the outlaws faded into the history books, a new, colder enemy began to emerge from the skyscrapers of Music Row: new Nashville executives. As Loretta reached her 9th decade, the faces in the boardrooms began to change, and with them, the very soul of the music she had bled for. Her final hatred wasn't directed at a specific peer or a rival singer, but at the anonymous, data-driven executives who she felt were turning country music into a plastic assembly line product. These were the suits who wouldn't know a coal mine from a gold mine if they fell into one. Loretta's disdain for the new Nashville was a fiery, protective rage. She looked at the polished, auto-tuned stars being pushed by the major labels, artists who looked like models, but sang about a rural life they had only seen through a car window, and she felt a profound sense of betrayal. To her, these executives were the ultimate musicians she hated, because they were the ones killing the truth that made the genre matter. Loretta's friction with the modern industry was a matter of authenticity. She famously lamented the Hat Act era and the subsequent bro-country movement, seeing them as hollow caricatures of the grit she represented. She hated the way radio consultants used algorithms to decide that women weren't marketable enough to be played back-to-back. Having broken the gender barrier in the 70s, Watching the industry slide back into a boys-only club in the 2010s was more than she could stomach. She didn't hold back in her critiques, often stating that country music is gone, and that the current crop of executives wouldn't recognize a real song if it bit them on the nose. This wasn't the grumbling of an old woman who couldn't keep up. It was the warning of a prophet who saw her temple being turned into a shopping mall. She loathed the way the industry began to prioritize vibe over story. Loretta's entire career was built on the narrative, the specific, painful, and often ugly details of a life lived. The new executives, however, wanted lifestyle music, songs about trucks, beer, and a version of country that was scrubbed clean of all its sorrow and sharp edges. Loretta viewed this as a personal insult to the people of Appalachia and the working-class fans who had kept her in business for 60 years. She saw these executives as cultural tourists who were stripping the genre of its dignity for a quick profit. Her hatred for the corporate machine became a rallying cry for independent artists. She used her final years to champion those who stayed outside the system, proving that at 90, she was still the most rebellious person in the room. The irony was that the more the industry tried to update the sound, the more the fans craved the raw honesty that only Loretta could provide. Her late career partnership with Jack White for the album Van Leer Rose was her final, triumphant middle finger to the Nashville suits. By working with a rock musician to produce the most authentic country album of the decade, she proved that the executives were wrong about what the audience wanted. She showed that you didn't need a committee of 20-somethings in a high-rise office to tell you how to be a star. You just needed a guitar and a life story that was true. Her feedback to the corporate ghosts was simple. You can't manufacture heart. In her final days at Hurricane Mills, Loretta spoke of the music business with a mixture of nostalgia and defiance. She knew that the machines might win the short-term battle for the charts, but they could never win the long-term war for the culture. She left behind a ledger that was as much a roadmap as it was a list of grievances. She had fought the gatekeepers, the egos, the controllers, the thieves, the rivals, the outlaws, and finally, the robots. She had hated them all with a passion that was rooted in her love for the music. And as she looked out over her ranch, she knew she had outlasted them all. The ghosts of the industry were many, but there was only ever one Loretta Lynn. So, after 90 years of brawling and singing, did she leave with a grudge or a clean slate? Comment your thoughts below and make sure to get subscribed and get notified for the next uploads.